Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we'll continue our reading of Red Planet by Robert Heinlein. Our heroes, Frank and Jim, tried to get home, and then some piece of strange Martian machinery took them right back where they started, so they asked to please be brought back home. The car started up at once. Frank said, "Whoops, what's this?" and sat down suddenly. The old Martian, secure on the resting frame, said nothing. Jim laughed. "Don't you remember the last ride?" "Not very well. Say, I feel heavy." "So do I. That's part of the ride. Now, how about a bite to eat? It may be a long time before we get another decent meal." Frank got out the remainder of their lunch. When they had finished, Frank thought about it and opened another can. Before they had had a chance to eat its contents, cold baked beans and surrogate pork, his stomach suddenly did a flip flop. "Hey!" he yelped. "What's happening?" "Nothing. It was like this last time." "I thought we'd plowed into something." "No, it's all right, I tell you. Hand me over some of those beans." They ate the beans and waited. After a time, the feeling of extra weight left them, and Jim knew that they had arrived. The door of the car compartment opened, and they stepped into a circular hall exactly like the one they had left. Frank looked around in disappointment. "Say, Jim, we haven't gone any place. There's some mistake." "No, there's not." He turned, intending to speak to the old Martian, but the archway door behind them was already closed. "Oh, that's too bad," he said. "What's too bad? That they gave us the runaround?" "They didn't give us the runaround. It's just that this room looks like the one back in Cinia. You'll see when we get up to the surface. No, I was saying too bad because I let—" Jim hesitated, realizing he had never gotten the old Martian's name. "Because I let the old fellow, not Gecko, the other one, get away without saying goodbye." "Who?" "You know, the other one, the one that rode with us." "What do you mean, the other one? I didn't see anybody but Gecko. And nobody rode with us. We were in there by ourselves." "Huh? You must be blind. You must be nuts. Frank Sutton, do you mean to stand there and tell me you didn't see the Martian that rode with us?" "You heard me the first time." Jim took a deep breath. "Well, all I've got to say is if you hadn't had your face buried in your food the whole time and had looked around occasionally, you'd have seen more. How in—" Forget it," Frank interrupted, "before you get me sore. There were 6 Martians, if you like it that way. Let's get on up and outside and see what the score is. We're wasting time." "Well, all right." They started up the ramps. Jim was very silent. The incident bothered him more than it did Frank. Part way up, they were forced to adjust their masks. 10 minutes or so thereafter, they reached a room into which the sunlight came flooding. They hurried through it and outdoors. A moment later, it was Frank's turn to be puzzled and uncertain. "Jim, I know I was lightheaded at the time, but wasn't that town we started from just a one-tower burg?" "It was." "This one isn't." "No, it isn't." "We're lost." "That's right." Chapter 9. Politics. They were in a large enclosed courtyard, such as characterizes many Martian buildings. They could make out the tops of the towers of the city, or some of them, but their view was much restricted. "What do you think we ought to do?" asked Frank. Try to find a native and see if we can find out where we've landed. I wish I hadn't let the old fellow get away from us," Jim added. "He spoke basic." "You're still harping on that," said Frank. "Anyway, I don't think our chances are good. This place looks utterly deserted. You know what I think? I think they've just dumped us." "I think they've just dumped us," agreed Willis. "Shut up. They wouldn't do that," Jim went on to Frank in worried tones. He moved around and stared over the roof of the building. "Say, Frank." "Yes?" "You see those 3 little towers just alike? You can just make out their tips?" "Well, what about them?" "I think I've seen them before." "Say, I think I have too." They began to run. 5 minutes later, they were standing on the city wall, and there was no longer any doubt about it. They were in the deserted part of Charax. Below them and about 3 miles away were the bubble domes of South Colony. 40 minutes of brisk walking, varied with dog trotting, got them home. They split up and went directly to their respective homes. "See you later," Jim called to Frank and hurried away to his father's house. It seemed to take forever for the pressure lock to let him through. Before the pressure had equalized, he could hear his mother, echoed by his sister, inquiring via the announcing speaker as to who was at the door, please. He decided not to answer, but to surprise them. Then he was inside, facing Phyllis, whose face was frozen in amazement, only to throw herself around his neck while shouting, "Mother, Mother, it's Jim, it's Jim!" And Willis was bouncing around the floor, chorusing, "It's Jim, it's Jim!" And his mother was crowding Phyllis aside and hugging him and getting his face wet with her tears, and Jim himself wasn't feeling any too steady. He managed to push them away presently. His mother stood back a little and said, "Just let me look at you, darling. Oh, my poor baby, are you all right?" She was ready to weep again. "Sure, I'm all right," Jim protested. "Why shouldn't I be? Say, is Dad home?" Mrs. Marlowe looked suddenly apprehensive. No, Jim, he's at work. I've got to see him right away. Say, Mom, what are you looking funny about?" "Why, because, nothing. I'll call your father right away." She went to the phone and called the ecological laboratory. He could hear her guarded tones. "Mr. Marlowe? Dear, this is Jane. Could you come home right away?" And his father's reply, "It wouldn't be convenient. What's up? You sound strange." His mother glanced over her shoulder at Jim. "Are you alone? Can I be overheard?" His father answered, "What's the matter? Tell me." His mother replied, almost in a whisper, "He's home." There was a short silence. His father answered, "I'll be there right away." In the meantime, Phyllis was grilling Jim. "Say, Jimmy, what in the world have you been doing?" Jim started to answer and thought better of it. "Kid, you wouldn't believe me if I told you." "I don't doubt it, but what have you been doing? You've sure got the folks in a stew." "Never mind. Say, what day is it?" "Saturday." "Saturday the what?" "Saturday the 14th of Ceres, of course." Jim was startled. 4 days? Only 4 days since he had left Syrtis Minor. Then, as he reviewed it in his mind, he accepted it. Granting Frank's assertion that the time he had spent down under Cinia was only 3 hours or so, the rest added up. "Gee, I guess I'm in time then." "What do you mean in time?" "Huh? Oh, you wouldn't understand it. Wait a few years, smarty." Mrs. Marlowe came away from the phone. "Your father will be right home, Jim." "So I heard. Good." She looked at him. "Are you hungry? Is there anything you would like?" "Sure, fatted calf and champagne. I'm not really hungry, but I could stand something. How about some cocoa? I've been living on cold stuff out of cans for days." "Cocoa there shall be." "Better eat what you can now," put in Phyllis. "Maybe you won't get what you want to eat when Phyllis." "But mother, I was just going to say, Phyllis, keep quiet or leave the room." Jim's sister subsided with muttering. Shortly, the cocoa was ready, and while Jim was drinking it, his father came in. His father shook hands with him soberly, as if he were a grown up. "It's good to see you home, son." "It feels mighty good to be home, Dad." Jim gulped the rest of the cocoa. "But look, Dad, I've got a lot to tell you, and there isn't any time to waste. Where's Willis?" He looked around. "Anybody seen where he went?" "Never mind Willis. I want to know." "But Willis is essential to this, Dad." "Oh, Willis, come here." Willis came waddling out of a passageway, and Jim picked him up. "All right, you've got Willis," Mr. Marlowe said. "Now pay attention. What is this mess you're in, son?" Jim frowned. "It's a little hard to know where to start." "There's a warrant out for you and Frank," burst out Phyllis. Mr. Marlowe said, "Jane, will you please try to keep your daughter quiet?" "Phyllis, you heard what I said before." "Oh, mother, everyone knows it." Possibly Jim did not know it. Jim said, "Oh, I guessed it. They had cops chasing us all the way home." "Frank came with you?" asked his father. "Oh, sure, but we gave him the slip. Those company cops are stupid." Mr. Marlowe frowned. "See here, Jim, I'm going to call up the resident and tell him you're here, but I'm not going to let you surrender until something a lot more definite is shown to me than I've seen so far, and certainly not until we've had your side of the matter. When you do surrender, Dad will go along with you and stick by you." Jim sat up straight. "Surrender? What are you talking about, Dad?" His father suddenly looked very old and tired. "Marlowes don't run away from the law, son. You know I'll stick by you no matter what you've done, but you've got to face up to it." Jim looked at his father defiantly. "Dad, if you think Frank and I have beaten our way across the better of 2,000 miles of Mars just to give up when we get here, well, you've got another think coming. And anybody that tries to arrest me is going to find it a hard job." Phyllis was listening round eyed. His mother was quietly dripping tears. His father said, "Son, you can't take that attitude." Jim said, "Can't I? Well, I do." Why don't you find out what this score is before you talk about giving me up? His voice was a bit shrill. His father bit his lip. His mother said, Please, James, why don't you wait and hear what he has to say? Of course I want to hear what he has to say, Mr. Marlowe answered irritably. Didn't I just say that? But I can't let my own son sit there and declare himself an outlaw. Please, James, speak your piece, son. Jim looked around. I don't know. I'm so anxious to start now, he said bitterly. This is a fine homecoming. You'd think I was a criminal or something. I'm sorry, Jim, his father said slowly. Let's keep first things first. Tell us what happened. Well, all right. But wait a minute. Phyllis said there was a warrant out for me? For what? Well, truancy, but that's not important. Actions to prejudice the good order and discipline at the school, and I myself don't know what they mean by that. It doesn't worry me, but the real charges are burglary and theft. And another one they tacked on a day later, escaping arrest. Escaping arrest? That's silly. They never caught us. So, how about the others? Theft is silly too. I didn't steal anything from him. Howe, I mean Headmaster Howe. He stole Willis from me. And then he laughed at me when I tried to get him back. I'll theft him. Go on with your story. The burglary business has got something to it. I busted into his office, or tried to, but he can't prove anything. I'd like to see him show how I could crawl through a 10-inch round hole. And we didn't leave any fingerprints, he added. Anyhow, I had a right to. He had Willis locked up inside. Say, Dad, can't we swear out a warrant against Howe for stealing Willis? Why should he have it all his own way? Wait a minute now, you've got me confused. If you have a cause for action against the headmaster, I'll certainly back you on it. But I want to get things straight. What hole? Did you cut a hole in the headmaster's door? No, Willis did. Willis? How can he cut anything? Darned if I know. He just grew an arm with a sort of claw on the end and cut his way out. I called to him and out he came. Mr. Marlowe rubbed his forehead. This gets more confusing all the time. How did you boys get here? By subway. You see, by subway, Jim looked thwarted. His mother put in, James, dear, I think perhaps he could tell his story better if we just let him tell it straight through without interrupting. I think you're right, Mr. Marlowe agreed. I'll reserve my questions. Phyllis, get me a pad and pencil. Thus facilitated, Jim started over and told a reasonably consecutive and complete story from Howe's announcement of military school inspections to their translation via Martian subway from Cinia to Charax. When Jim had done, Mr. Marlowe pulled his chin. Jim, if you didn't have a lifelong reputation for stubborn honesty, I'd think you were romancing. As it is, I have to believe it, but it is the most fantastic thing I ever heard. You still think I ought to surrender? Eh? No, this puts it in a different light. You leave it up to Dad. I'll call the resident. Just a second, Dad. Eh? I didn't tell you all of it. What? You must, son, if I'm to. I didn't want to get my story followed up with another issue entirely. I'll tell you, but I want to know something. Isn't the colony supposed to be on its way by now? It was supposed to have been, agreed his father. Migration would have started yesterday by the original schedule, but there's been a 2 weeks postponement. That's not a postponement, Dad. It's a frame up. The company isn't going to allow the colony to migrate this year. They mean to make us stay here all through the winter. What? That's ridiculous, son. A polar winter is no place for terrestrials. But you're mistaken. It's just a postponement. The company is revamping the power system at North Colony and is taking advantage of an unusually late winter to finish it before we get there. I'm telling you, Dad, that's just a stall. The plan is to keep the colony here until it's too late and force you to stay here through the winter. I can prove it. How? Where's Willis? The bouncer had wandered off again, checking up on his domains. Never mind Willis. You've made an unbelievable charge. What makes you think of such a thing? Speak up, son. But I have to have Willis to prove it. Here, boy, come to Jim. Jim gave a rapid summary of what he had heard through Willis's phonographic hearing, following which he tried to get Willis to perform. Willis was glad to perform. He ran over almost all the boys' conversation of the last few days, repeating a great amount of Martian speech that was incomprehensible, out of context, and saying, Quien es la señorita? But he could not or would not recall Beecher's conversation. Jim was still coaxing him when the phone sounded. Mr. Marlowe said, Phyllis, answer that. She trotted back in a moment. It's for you, Daddy. Jim shut Willis up. They could hear both ends of the conversation. Marlowe, this is the resident agent. I hear that boy of yours has turned up. Jim's father glanced over his shoulder, hesitated. Yes, he's here. Well, keep him there. I'm sending a man over to pick him up. Mr. Marlowe hesitated again. That's not necessary, Mr. Kruger. I'm not through talking with him. He won't go away. Come, come, Marlowe, you can't interfere with orderly legal processes. I'm executing that warrant at once. You are? You just think you are. Mr. Marlowe started to add something, thought better of it, and switched off. The phone sounded again almost at once. If that's the resident, he said, I won't speak to him. If I do, I'll say something I'll regret. But it was not. It was Frank's father. Marlowe, Jamie, this is Pat Sutton. The conversation showed that each father had gotten around to about the same point with his son. We were just about to try and get something out of Jim's bouncer, Mr. Marlowe added. It seems he's overheard a pretty damning conversation. Yes, I know, agreed Mr. Sutton. I want to hear it too. Hold on till we get there. Fine. Oh, by the way, friend Kruger is out to arrest the kids right away. Watch out. How well I know it. He just called me and I put a flea in his ear. Bye now. Mr. Marlowe switched off, then went to the front door and locked it. He did the same to the door to the tunnels. He was none too soon. The signal showing that someone had entered the pressure lock came on shortly. Who is it? Called out Jim's father. Company business. What sort of company business and who is it? This is the resident proctor. I've come for James Marlowe, Jr. You might as well go away again. You won't get him. There was a whispered exchange outside the door, and then the lock was rattled. Open up that door, came another voice. We have a warrant. Go away. I'm switching off the speaker. Mr. Marlowe did so. The pressure lock indicator showed presently that the visitors had left, but shortly it indicated occupancy again. Mr. Marlowe switched the speaker back on. If you've come back, you may as well leave, he said. What sort of welcome is this, Jamie boy? Came Mr. Sutton's voice. Oh, Pat, are you alone? Only my boy Francis, and that's all. They were let in. Did you see anything of Proctor's? Mr. Marlowe inquired. Yep, I ran into him. Pop told him that if they touched me, he'd make him sorry, Frank said proudly, and he would, too. Jim caught his father's eye. Mr. Marlowe looked away. Mr. Sutton went on. Now, what's all this about Jim's pet having evidence for us? Let's crank him up and hear him talk. We've been trying to, Jim said. I'll try again. Here, Willis. He took him in his lap. Now, look, Willis. Do you remember Headmaster Howe? Willis promptly became a featureless ball. That's not the way to do it, objected Frank. You remember what set him off before. Here, Willis. Willis extended his eyes. Listen to me, chum. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mark. Frank continued in a fair imitation of the agent general's rich, affected tones. Sit down, my boy. Always happy to see you, Willis continued in exact imitation of Beecher's voice. He went on from there, reciting perfectly the two conversations he had overheard between the headmaster and the resident agent general, and including the meaningless interlude between. When he had finished and seemed disposed to continue with all that had followed up to the present moment, Jim shut him off. Well, Jim's father said, what do you think of it, Pat? I think it's terrible, put in Jim's mother. Mr. Sutton screwed up his face. Tomorrow I am taking myself down to Syrtis Minor, and there I shall take the place apart with my two hands. An admirable sentiment, agreed Mr. Marlowe, but this is a matter for the whole colony. I think our first step should be to call a town meeting and let everyone know what we're up against. Huh, no doubt you are right, but you'll be taking all the fun out of it. Mr. Marlowe smiled. I imagine there will be excitement enough to suit you before this is over. Kruger isn't going to like it, and neither is the Honorable Mr. Gaines Beecher. Mr. Sutton wanted Dr. McCrae to examine Frank's throat, and Jim's father decided, over Jim's protest, it would be a good idea to have him examine Jim as well. The two men escorted the boys to the doctor's house. There, Mr. Marlowe instructed them, stay here until we get back, kids. I don't want Kruger's proctors picking you up. I'd like to see him try. Me too. I don't want them to try. I want to settle matters first. We're going over to the residence office and offer to pay for the food you kids appropriated. And Jim, I'll offer to pay for the damage Willis did to the headmaster's precious door. Then, but Dad, we oughtn't to pay for that. Howe shouldn't have locked him up. I agree with the kid, said Mr. Sutton. The food now, that's another matter. The boys took it, we pay for it. You're both right, agreed Mr. Marlowe, but it's worth it to knock the props out from under these ridiculous charges. Then I'm going to swear out a warrant against Howe for attempting to steal or enslave Willis. What would you say it was, Pat? Steal or enslave? Call it steel. You'll not be raising side issues then. All right, then I shall insist that he consult the planet office before taking any action. I think that will stop his clock for the time being. Dad, put in Jim, you aren't going to tell the resident that we found out about the migration frame up, are you? He would just turn around and call Beecher. Not just yet, though he's bound to know at the town meeting. He won't be able to call Beecher then. Dymos sets in 2 hours. Mr. Marlowe glanced at his watch. See you later, boys. We've got things to do. Dr. McRae looked up as they came in. Maggie, bar the door, he called out. We've got two dangerous criminals. Howdy, Doc. Come in and rest yourselves. Tell me all about it. It was fully an hour later that McRae said, well, Frank, I suppose I'd better look you over. Then I'll have a look at you, Jim. There's nothing wrong with me, Doc. Start some more coffee while I take care of Frank. The room was well stocked with the latest diagnostic equipment, but McRae did not bother with it. He tilted Frank's head back, told him to say ah, thumped his chest, and listened to his heart. You'll live, he decided. Any kid who can hitchhike from Syrtis to Charax will live a long time. Hitchhike? Asked Frank. Beat your way, the expression I used back when I was your age. Your turn, Jim. He took even less time to dispose of Jim. Then the three friends settled back to visit. I want to know more about this night you spent in the Cabbage Head, Doc announced. Willis, I can understand, since any Martian creature can tuck his tail in and live indefinitely without air. But by rights, you two should have been smothered. The plant closed up entirely? Oh, yes, Jim assured him, then related the event in more detail. When he got to the point about the flashlight, McRae stopped him. That's it, that's it. You didn't mention that before. The flashlight saved your lives, son. Huh? How? Photosynthesis. You shine the light on green leaf and it can no more help taking in carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen than you could help breathing. The doc stared at the ceiling, his lips moving while he figured. Must have been pretty stuffy, but all the same. You were short on green leaf surface. What kind of torch was it? The GE Midnight Sun. It was stuffy, terribly. The Midnight Sun has enough candle power to do the trick. Hereafter, I'll carry one if I'm going further than 20 feet from my doorstep. It's a good dodge. Something that still puzzles me, said Jim, is how I could see a movie that covered every bit of the time I've had Willis, minute by minute, without missing anything, and have it turn out to be only 3 or 4 hours. That, Doc said slowly, is not nearly so mysterious as the other matter, the matter of why you were shown this. Huh? I've been wondering about that too, put in Frank. After all, Willis is a pretty insignificant creature. Take it easy, Jim. What was the point in running over his biography for Jim? What do you think, Doc? The only hypothesis I've got on that point is so wildly fantastic, I will keep it to myself, thank you. But on the point of time, Jim, can you think of any way to photograph a person's memories? No. I'll go further and say flatly that it is impossible. Yet you describe seeing what Willis remembered. That suggest anything to you? No, admitted Jim. It's got me stumped, but I did see it. Sure you did. Because seeing takes place in the brain and not in the eye. I can close my eyes and see the Great Pyramid shimmering in the desert heat. I can see the donkeys and hear the porters yelling at the tourists. See 'em? Shucks, I can smell 'em, but it's just memory. Now back to what I was saying, Jim. When only one hypothesis covers the facts, you've got to accept it. You saw what the old Martian wanted you to see. Call it hypnosis. But, but, Jim was wildly indignant. It felt like an attack on his very inner being. But I did see it, I tell you. I was there. I'll string along with Doc, Frank told him. You were still seeing things on the trip back. The old boy did so make the trip back with us. If you had kept your eyes open, you'd have seen him. Easy there, cautioned Doc. If you lugs want to fight, go outside. Has it occurred to you that both of you might be right? What? How could we both be? Objected Frank. I don't like to put words to it, but I can tell you this. I've lived long enough to know that a man does not live by bread alone, and that the cadaver I perform an autopsy on is not the man himself. The most wildly impossible philosophy of all is materialism. We'll leave it at that. Frank was about to object again when the lock signaled visitors. The boys' parents were back. Come in, gentlemen, the doctor roared. You're just in time. We were having a go at solipsism. Pull up a pulpit and take a part. Coffee? Solipsism, is it? Said Mr. Sutton. Francis, pay no mind to the old heathen. You listen to what Father Cleary tells you. You'll pay no mind to me anyhow, McCrae answered. That's the healthy thing about kids. How did you make out with the Lord High Executioner? Mr. Marlowe chuckled. Kruger was fit to be tied. And we'll get deeper into Martian politics next time.